This is an interview conducted at the office of Dan Shouvlin on May 30, 1995, the conductor being Roland Matthies, and this being for the benefit of the Clark County Historical Society archives. This will now be a test. Dan, what we're primarily interested in is, first of all, the whole story of the Bauer Brothers company as it began, why it got here, what it developed into, and why it quit. And that could be a long story, but it's up to you as to how much you want to talk.
Okay. Well, Bauer was founded in 1878 by the three Bauer brothers, Charlie, William, and Louis. And I got that wrong.
It's all right.
Start over?
It's all right.
Yeah.
Yep, we'll review it all afterwards.
Okay, that wasn't correct.
Just want to be sure I'm getting your voice.
Yeah. The Bauer Brothers Company was founded in 1878 by Gustavus Foos. And he had some associates, including local businessmen, William Copenhaver and Mr. Bradley, and several others. And it started out as a company to make corn planting and harvesting equipment. Initially they had a building out on Sheridan Avenue. In fact, the building is still there. It was now, or was part of D&H Manufacturing, which is now closed. But they started out there and stayed on that site until 1977 when Bauer was moved to the Upper Valley Pike.
Well, let's just run a test, huh? Let's see. Okay.
The Fooses operated the company until around 1900 when old Gus died. He had several sons, and apparently he tried to get the sons to come into the business, but they weren't interested apparently. They had their own businesses by that time. So he sold out to the three Bauer brothers, Charles, William, and Louis. And incidentally, the Gus Foos had immigrated from Germany, and the Bauers had immigrated from Germany.
Were the Bauers living in Springfield at that time?
Yeah, they were living in Springfield at that time, and they were mixed up in some other businesses that apparently somehow got involved with Gustavus Foos and ended up buying his business. And they changed the name from the original name of Foos Manufacturing Company to the Bauer Brothers about 1904, somewhere in that area. And it operated under that name until it was acquired by Combustion Engineering in 1968, and then it was just changed to Combustion Engineering Bauer, CE Bauer. But the Bauers continued to operate it in pretty much the same manner as Gus Foos had done so, making corn planting and harvesting equipment. They branched out into other types of agricultural equipment, but it was basically a company manufacturing agricultural equipment.
Were the three brothers equally involved?
Well, Charlie was the president, and Will, as I recall through the old minutes, was the vice president, and Louis was the treasurer. That could have been the other way around, but they were all involved in the business. I don't know too much about what went on in those days, the early days. We did have minutes of the meetings from the time the company was founded, but they were not that complete. In those days, most of the minutes were handwritten, and I suspect that whoever was doing the writing got tired of writing. We didn't write it all down. I do recall, though, that in one of the first sets of minutes of the meeting of the company that they hired a plant manager and they paid him $600 a year, which at that time apparently was a lot of money. And they made a little money. They didn't make a lot of money, but they were profitable. In fact, I think they only, in the history of the company, there were maybe only 1 or 2 years where it didn't make money. And one of those years was in the Depression. But they moved along and had a nice little business, and as part of the farm equipment, they made an attrition mill, which was used primarily for grinding corn out in the Midwest, in Iowa, Illinois, Kansas, and so forth. Long in, I guess it was in the early 20s, they sold one of those attrition mills to a company up in Minnesota called Wood Conversion. And they were taking wood chips and grinding it up and making insulation board. That was the first time that those attrition mills had been used for the, I would say the paper industry, but or the board industry. At that time, they were just making a rather rough board. During the 20s, they just plugged along, and the company grew little by little, not that much. But when the Depression came along, why, they never lost money during the Depression. I think 1 year they might have lost a little money, but not too much. And then after when the Depression ended at the beginning of World War II, so happened my grandfather, P.J. Shouvlin, and my Uncle Joe were on the board at Bauer. And they had their own plant, Superior Gas Engine Company, right down the street. When the war began, my Uncle Joe and my grandfather had negotiated a contract with the Army to produce 105 millimeter shells. Well, the National Supply Company wasn't much interested in that, so Joe and P.J. went down the street and leased space from the Bauer Brothers Company to produce these shells for the Army. And I don't know how many millions of shells they produced, but they produced a lot from I'm going to say 1941 through the end of the war. In fact, I worked on that shell line during 2 summers while I was in college.
I can't picture 105 millimeter. How big is it?
They're about, I'm going to say, a foot in tall and maybe 6 inches in diameter. All we did at Bauer was to machine them and get them ready for the installation of the powder and the cap, which was done, I think, at one of the arsenals, the Army arsenals. We didn't do that here. All we did was make the shell casing. So they did that all during the war, and of course the other equipment that Bauer was making at the time, and they had gravitated into peanut butter equipment as well as the farm implementing equipment, and they had also developed a line of oilseed cleaning equipment for the cottonseed oil business. But those businesses were dead during the war, and I think the only thing they sold were maintenance parts. But the shell line kept the plant busy, and I ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year for several years. At the end of the war, the 3 Bauer brothers were quite old at the time by certain standards. I don't think that's as old now, but they were in their 70s, and they had, I think one of them had I'm not sure, there was a Bill Bauer that later on married Don Samuelson's sister. And he was the son of either Louis or William. But Charlie had no children. And anyhow, Bill wasn't interested in business, so they sold it and retired. And my grandfather and my 2 uncles purchased the company from the Bauers in 1946.
Who was the other uncle?
Uncle Ray Shouvlin.
Oh, yes.
Uncle Joe and P.J. And I forget now, but the company at the end of the war, their other businesses were pretty slow because of non-activity during the war, and of course, as soon as the war ended, the shell business shut down. I think the day after peace was declared. So they had to find something to produce in this plant that they had. Well, based on the, meantime, they had hired a consultant by the name of Clint Texter. Many of the people will remember him in Springfield.
How do you spell it?
Textor, Clint Texter. He lived over in Ardmore Road, he and his wife Lillian. And anyhow, Clint was an authority in the paper industry. And he convinced Uncle Joe and Uncle Ray they should take their equipment into the paper industry using the attrition mills, and they were then renamed as refiners, pulp refiners. And they had developed a close association with the Mead people in Dayton, who eventually became one of their best customers. But they gravitated into the pulp and paper industry through this attrition mill, and in 1947, I guess it was, Uncle Joe developed a line of shelving for the Frigidaire company in Dayton, welded wire shelving and wire baskets. And that became not a big profit maker, but it kept a number of people employed and generated a lot of cash. Most of them went out in the way of expenses, so it really never made a whole lot of money. But Clint Texter got him very much involved in the paper industry, and that's where Bauer really grew. I joined the company in 1952, having been in Boston working for a CPA firm, and Uncle Joe bugged me to come back out here and go to work for the family, and reluctantly I did. My wife being a Bostonian, she wasn't too thrilled with the idea of moving to Ohio. But we did come out, and the first year I was here, the company managed to acquire the rights to a patent that had been developed by the Hammermill Paper Company. And this was a centrifugal cleaner, cone-shaped device that had the unique ability to take dirt out of pulp slurries before the slurry went on the paper machine. And the rights to this patent were acquired the first year I was with the company in 1952. And, I recall clearly that Uncle Joe got myself and Morris Woodruff, who was our chief engineer at the time, and I think many of the Springfield people will remember Woody. I think he was a member of the Covenant Presbyterianship. Anyhow, he wanted us to make a market study and tell him how much in terms of dollars and how many units of these centric cleaners we were going to sell. Well, I was no engineer and Woody was no marketing person, so we put together what was probably the world's worst forecast. We said that in a period of maybe 5, 6, 10 years, we'd sell $5 million worth of these devices. We had sold $3 million the first year. We quit counting when we got to $100 million worth of cleaners some years later. And they're still making those cleaners and still selling them.
Where?
They make them up in New York State now. When Bauer moved in they moved manufacturing in 72, and then they moved the whole operation up in about 80 to 85. But they still make those units up in New York State, and they still sell them. But anyhow, that was the beginning of Bauer. We had a product that was patented, and it had immediate acceptance in the paper industry, because dirt, as you can imagine, was undesirable in paper. It causes breaks on the paper machine, in addition to making the paper somewhat undesirable in many respects. The first system we sold was to a company called Gaspezia Sulfite up in
How do you spell that?
Gaspesia, Gaspezia, French-Canadian word, and it was a French-Canadian company up in the province of Quebec. They had had a shipment of their paper rejected by the New York Times because it was too dirty.
Oh.
So we had a salesman up there that was quite a character, but at least he made one sale, and that was it. He sold Gaspezia with some of these cleaners. Well, after they got them installed in a few months, their paper was accepted by the New York Times, and some of the other manufacturers' paper were rejected because of dirt. Well, they all got in line to buy some of these century cleaners, so we couldn't make them fast enough.
How big a thing are you talking about?
Well, it was
physically.
The early ones were, I'd say they were about 15 inches high and probably 4 or 5 inches in diameter, and they were a cone-shaped thing. The pulp was entered into the cone under pressure, 50-pound pressure, and it circulated down through the cone in like a cyclone, actually. And the dirt fell out the bottom, and the good pulp went back up through the top.
So we're just talking about something the size of a suitcase.
Not even that big.
Not even that big.
And each one of these units would handle a certain number of tons. And as time went on, we made larger and larger cleaners, and by the time that I left the company, we were making what we called a 12-inch cleaner, and that was about, I'd say 4 feet tall, maybe a good foot in diameter. And it did the same cleaning job, but it was a larger unit to handle more capacity. But anyhow, these cleaners revolutionized the paper industry. In fact, it produced enough income so Bauer was able to develop some other ideas that they had, which included a new method of making groundwood, which is the basic pulp for newsprint, making groundwood out of chips rather than out of logs. The old process was pushing a log against a stone and ripping off the fibers, and then they were further processed into the newsprint. Well, this way, instead of grinding the logs against a stone, we just chipped them up and ran them through these refiners and made much stronger pulp, much cheaper. This was an idea that was developed by Clint Texter. Clint used to sit out in the backyard of the Bauer Brothers company on Sheridan Avenue and get himself a cup of coffee and sit on the steps and stare at the sky. And everybody always wondered what the hell he was doing, but he was just thinking. And anyhow, he came up with several processes, but this so-called refiner groundwood was his baby. And it again revolutionized the industry and made cheaper and better pulp. And they were also able to use types of wood that previously had not been usable.
Who had the patents?
Bauer had the patents on this. We had applied for patents, and we got some patents on this new process.
Also on the cleaner?
Well, we had acquired the rights to the cleaner. Of course, as time went on, we improved the units, and we got continuation patents on the cleaner. We had a convention up in Canada, and I guess it was in the early 60s. They had a keynote speaker from England, whose name evades me at the moment, but he was a very prominent person in the paper industry. And he remarked that the paper industry was very old-fashioned, that they weren't coming up with many new developments. In fact, he said there have been only 3 new developments in the paper industry in 100 years. One was the new paper machine, the Ford Rainier, which was a continuous web, making paper on a continuous paper rather than sheet by sheet. And he said there were only 2 other major developments. One was the centrifugal cleaner, and the other was refiner groundwood. The latter 2, of course, were developed by Bauer.
Yeah.
So we acquired quite a reputation in the paper industry, and then we built another, in addition to expanding the plant in Springfield, we built a plant in Brantford, Ontario, and we had licensees in Japan, almost every country in Europe that made pulp, or that made paper, South America, and South Africa. We even did a fair amount of business with the Russians, which at that time was rather unusual. So the company grew, and when I joined it in 1952, they did about $1 million in volume, which wasn't too bad in those days. When I left in '82, we were doing about 80 million. And we were highly profitable for the company, the combustion engineering, that purchased us. We had a lot of great people working for us, some still here in Springfield. Lee Eberhardt, some of the Bauer people who were with us for a number of years are, of course, retired or dead. But some of the younger ones are still around working for Bob Patton out at West Patton. I guess they have a new name for the division, fluid equipment. But they're making some of the old Bauer equipment. Bauer was quite successful. In 1968, Uncle Ray had died in the meantime, and Uncle Joe's health was not as great as it should have been. And he decided all of a sudden he was going to sell the company. He had some sons, but none of them were interested. Well, they were pretty young at the time, but apparently there was no real interest in going into the business. So we sold out to Combustion Engineering, which was a Fortune 500 company, headquartered in, well, their main office was in New York, but their basic operating unit was in Hartford, Connecticut. And they took over in 1968, and I stayed with them until 1983, and Joe retired, Uncle Joe retired the year they took us over in 1968.
Where was the plant when Joe retired?
Out on Sheridan Avenue.
And didn't Combustioneer move the plant?
Well, we kept telling them that we needed a new modern plant, and we wanted to get rid of the wire division. It was so integrated into the whole plant out in Sheridan Avenue, it would have been almost impossible to sell the wire division on its own. So Combustion wasn't interested in wire anyhow. So in 1972 we reorganized, and much of our manufacturing was shifted to other Combustion plants, one in Upper New York State and two in Kansas. But we still had the research laboratory here, which in itself was very unique in the industry. We had one of the very few complete pulp research plants in the world. We had people coming to Springfield from all over the world to bring their raw material.
Is that right?
We had people from China, India, Russia, Pakistan, any country that made paper. They brought their wood in here to see if we could make something out of it. Usually we were successful. And we sold plants all over the world. We sold them Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Russia, Poland, Japan, all over Europe, Turkey, India. I spent a few interesting weeks in India and a few interesting weeks in Turkey during that period of time. But anyhow, our worldwide business was about 60% of our business by that time.
What was your involvement personally? Sales?
Well, when I came with the company, of course, I came as an accountant, which was my background. But, I hadn't been there very long, probably maybe less than a year, and we had modernized the accounting department to some degree. This was in the age before computers, and I had enough to do. But one day I was up in Uncle Joe's office, and he said, "I think you ought to get down and buy a briefcase." And I said, "What do I need a briefcase for?" He says, "Well, you're going to become a salesman." So I just raised my eyebrows and went down and bought a briefcase.
I can just hear him.
Yeah. And much to my wife's chagrin, because I started traveling. And one of the reasons that we moved to Ohio was when I was with Touche, well, it's now Deloitte Touche and Company, CPAs in Boston. Well, I traveled almost all the time, so we thought moving out here to Springfield I would do as much traveling. Well, when I bought the briefcase, that began my travels, and I traveled about 60% of the time from there on. Now, Barbara ultimately got used to it, but at first she wasn't really too pleased about my absences from home for extended periods. But anyhow, our business became international, and we had licensees all over the world. We sold equipment all over the world. Combustion Engineering was delighted because they were an international company themselves. Now, we were a pretty small part of Combustion, but we got along very well with them. They left us alone.
Where were they headquartered?
The main office was in New York on Park Avenue, but their operating office was in Windsor, Connecticut, which is a suburb of Hartford.
Well, who was operating this? Uncle Joe? Was he the operating officer?
Oh, he had retired by now.
He was retired.
I was running it.
You were running it?
Yeah.
As of when?
Well, I became president of Bauer in 1967, the year before we were acquired. And then I stayed with them until '83. But in 1977, they moved me to a division vice president. I had Bauer. I had a company up in New York State, two in Kansas, and one in Tulsa reporting to me. But I still had my headquarters here in Ohio. And that worked fine until, these big corporations are constantly reorganizing.
Yeah.
And about every other year they reorganize. Well, in 1982 they reorganized again, and they reorganized my division out of existence. So I thought, well, now it's time to retire. But they talked me into staying for another year, and I was operating an international division for one of the groups in combustion. But it required my being in Connecticut every week. I traveled for 52 weeks. I'd go up there on Sunday night and come home on Friday night. Well, I got tired of that, so I did take. So I took early retirement in 1983. But in the meantime, of course, Bauer kept on going, and but again, as I said a few minutes ago, these big companies, they keep reorganizing. So they decided one day they were going to consolidate all of their manufacturing operations. So they moved everything of Bauer except the research laboratory, which is still here in Springfield, up to Pennsylvania, Muncie, Pennsylvania, and moved a lot of Bauer people with them. But a lot of them didn't go. They just stayed here and went with other companies. Many of them are still around. But Combustion moved Bauer and merged it with another company up in Pennsylvania. It's still operating up there. I don't have much contact with them anymore because they reorganized again after that and sold Bauer to an Austrian company. So Bauer is now, the old Bauer company is now owned by a company called Andritz of Austria. We had done some business with them years ago, and they're a good company. But and I guess they're still operating up in Pennsylvania under the name of Bauer Andritz.
Doing essentially the same thing?
Yeah, but the paper industry has changed. Well, of course, Bauer initially in the farm implement business, and then they got into peanut butter equipment, they got into oilseed equipment, and they had the wire division. Of course, they made shells during the war for the Army. But after the I'd say after Combustion purchased us in 1968, they supplied us with the working capital that enabled us to take on big projects. And we were selling systems, $10, $15 million systems, which we never could have been able to do as Bauer itself. Mm-hmm. But they supplied the financial strength to enable us to do that. And we made good money for it. But the paper industry has changed. A lot of mergers, a lot of fallen by the wayside. A lot of the equipment manufacturers have fallen by the wayside. And some of them come on a hard time. It seems as though the paper industry goes through 5-year cycles. And the first year, business was a little better, second year better, third year better, fourth year better, fifth year is you boom year, and sixth year you're back down in the cellar with no business at all. The thing about the paper industry was that you put in a paper machine, they'll make 300, 400, 500, 600 tons a day of paper a day. And that's the only way they can make money is to run those suckers all the time, day and night. And when business turns down, they just don't buy any new equipment. But then when the consumption catches up again, then everybody decides they're going to expand at once. So then we go through that 5-year cycle. But Bauer was always, and of course I don't know now, I have no more contact with it, but Bauer was always profitable. We only had a couple of losing years, and we were pretty well regarded by Combustion, and we were well regarded in the paper. We had some real bright people, and we did some pretty bright things.
Now, what's the purpose of having a laboratory in Springfield?
Well, over the years, we had developed this very sophisticated laboratory. We were able to take any kind of raw material and make paper out of it. We didn't have a big paper machine, but they have machines that make hand sheets that represent sheets of paper or rolls of paper.
That's out on Upper Valley Pike.
Yeah, it's still on Upper Valley Pike, and the reason they haven't moved is they can't afford it. Costs a lot of money to put that laboratory in, and to move all that equipment and to put the foundations and the wiring and the electrical hookups in there just wouldn't be worthwhile. So they decided to keep it here. And it's still operating.
How many employees are there?
Oh, I think they probably have 20.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, they're still doing a lot of research work in the paper. The plant itself out there, the office building and the rest of the plant, was purchased by Rittal from Germany. And they're just in the process now of adding 100,000 square feet.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. They're a very fine, very profitable company and very well known in the industry. And I think I've been to their headquarters in Germany. I think it's in Herborn, Germany. Nice people, good people.
Yeah, I need to interview that man, Wagner.
Wagner, yeah.
Yeah.
Very successful young man. He's a young fellow. He's
Is he?
probably only 40. That's real young.
That's real young.
But he's very, very able and a very nice young man, and been very, very successful.
Now, Dan.
But Bauer goes on. It's still there. It probably isn't as prominent in the industry as it used to be, but a lot of that has to do with changes in the industry, and a lot of it has to do with changes in people. And unfortunately, Bauer has been undergone 3 or 4 different ownerships in the last 20 years, and that really hasn't helped much either.
Yeah.
With each new ownership brings new rules and new regulations.
Yeah.
But we made good equipment and good customers, good people.
Now tell us the story of the Shouvlin family. I still don't have your father straight in my mind.
Well, my grandfather, P.J. Shouvlin, was the first of the Shouvlins to arrive in Springfield, and he arrived here about 1880. His family had immigrated from Donegal in Ireland. And they settled in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and his father worked in the coal mines up there. Apparently, his father either died or was killed at a fairly young age, and P.J.'s mother had to raise a family. P.J. was fairly young at the time. He was only 3 years old when they came over from Ireland, and he had a brother, Dan, Uncle Dan, who had just been born when they immigrated from Ireland over here. And then when they got here, they had 2 more children. Barney, who was Bernard Shouvlin, who was killed in a shot fight back in the early 1902 or 3. And they had a sister who, Mary, who died quite young. But anyhow, they arrived here from Pennsylvania. P.J. had worked for the railroad. He was working for the Erie Railroad. He only had 4 years of formal education. And then he went to work in the coal mines over in Allentown, in the Allentown area. And he also worked in some of the steel mills over there. But he became a mechanic and apparently had some mechanical ability. And so the railroad moved him out here. They had a repair shop here in Springfield. And while he was working for the railroad, he studied at night and became the equivalent of a graduate engineer. And
this is P.J.
P.J., my grandfather.
Uh-huh.
And obviously a very, very bright individual. With only 4 years of formal education, he became a design engineer on diesel and gas engines. Many of the ones that they built, he designed himself. But then he left the railroad, and he and his 2 brothers formed a machine shop down on Washington Street called the Shouvlin Brothers.
Now, what was their names?
P.J. was Patrick J., and Uncle Dan, Daniel J., and Barney, Bernard, were the 3 brothers. And anyhow, they started this machine shop, and none of them had a lot of education, formal education, so they weren't much for writing down what they did. So when I got around to writing a family history back in 1984, and the only background I had was about 3 pages of biography that PJ had started, and then he quit for some reason. So we don't know. There was a lot of the family history we had to go dig out, and there's a lot of, well, I remember this, I remember that. We're not so sure how accurate it is.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, they started this machine shop on Washington Street. The family doctor was a doctor by the name of Linus Russell.
Oh, yeah.
And he had a son who lived here for a number of years and ran a company here in Springfield. It's now owned by somebody else. But Dr. Russell, being the family doctor, why, I guess in those days, doctors gave advice not only on your health, but on your what you did for a living. Anyhow, PJ went to him with an idea that he was going to build a steam engine, but he needed a product to sell. Well, Dr. Linus Russell convinced him that the age of the steam engine was about over, and oil had been discovered up in Pennsylvania, and that he ought to be thinking about developing an internal combustion engine. So apparently he went back to the drawing board, and he and his brother designed a gas engine that was used for pumping oil out in the oil field. And somehow or another he became acquainted with John D. Rockefeller in Cleveland. And at that time, of course, the Rockefellers had the Standard Oil of Ohio. And it was broken up into, by the Antitrust Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act, they had to break it up into divisions, and one of the divisions was the Ohio Oil Company, up in Findlay, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And that was operated by the Donnells. And my grandfather and the Donnells became very good friends. And so he started selling them and Standard Oil his pumping engines. And they were very successful, and the company grew, and they moved out to Sheridan Avenue and produced big gas engines for pumping in the oil field, and then they developed a line of diesel engines for power, stationary engines. And sold those to, well, we had one on our destroyer during the war. It was an auxiliary backup engine. I don't think we ever used it. We had it, but he sold engines to diesel engines to telephone companies for backup power generation.
Now we're still talking about 3 Shouvlins.
Mm-hmm.
Your grandfather?
My grandfather.
And 2 granduncles?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyhow, time went on, and the business was quite successful, and I think PJ made a buck or two. And in 1928, well, in the meantime, my dad worked for them. My dad was Dan Shouvlin. Uncle Joe worked for them. Joe was the youngest of that family. Uncle Ray, who was a lawyer, and he ran PJ had purchased a plant in Philadelphia, and Uncle Ray was running that. And there was another brother, Jack, who was quite a guy. He was the only one that didn't go to college, but he was quite a mechanic, and he was pretty much the troubleshooter for the company. My dad was a graduate engineer, and he ran the engineering department, and Uncle Ray ran, of course, I mentioned, ran the plant in Philadelphia, which made a diesel engine for submarines. And Joe was a finance person. He was here in Springfield. So they all worked for the company, and all did reasonably well, I guess. I went through the Depression, and business wasn't very good during the Depression, but PJ kept everybody working in the shop, and I know that he used up a fair amount of his wealth paying the guys when there was just no work in the shop. In fact, during the Depression, he decided to build a road from Leffels Lane, East Leffels Lane, to Calvary Cemetery, up along the railroad tracks. And he had the fellows in the shop under the supervision of my dad and Uncle Jack. They spent several years during the summer months building that road. And, of course, he paid them.
And what was the name of the company that your grandfather and your 2 granduncles formed?
Well, when they had their machine shop down on Washington
Yeah.
Street, it was the Shouvlin brothers. Then they moved out to Sheridan Avenue. I'm not sure what year. We were kind of unclear in our minds when they moved out there. It was probably around 1900. And the plant's still there. It's owned now by Cooper. It's,
Oh, yeah.
Cooper Energy Services. But they moved out there around 1900 and built a new plant. It's still there. I mean, it's been changed a lot. And so they changed the name of the company to the Superior Gas Engine Company. And the name of the engines were Superior Engines. Where they came up with that name, I don't know. It was the Superior Gas Engine Company. Then in 1928, for reasons best known to my grandfather, he decided to sell out to the National Supply Company of Pittsburgh. And they were in the oil and gas business. And of course, so was the Superior Gas Engine Company. But somewhere along in there was a moratorium on inheritance taxes. And to the best of my knowledge, why P.J. took advantage of it and sold his company and gave his money to his kids in trust. And continued to work with the company, and my uncle, my dad, my uncles did too, until 1940. That's when the fight came about the shell line. And that's when my two uncles, my grandfather, went down to the Bauer Brothers company down the street and developed the shell line. In the meantime, my dad went into the War Production Board, and Uncle Ray went to work for the Baldwin Engine Company in Philadelphia doing defense work. And Uncle Jack went with the Tampa Shipbuilding Company down in Tampa, Florida, also, of course, doing war work. So they all left in 1940. And of course, the younger generation, including myself, were in service. Uncle Joe went into service. He was the chief of the Ordnance District in Cincinnati during the war. He wasn't going to go in, I guess, but they offered, as I understand it, they said, we'll give you a commission in the ordnance, or we will draft you as a private. So it didn't take much time to make that choice. But Joe was in the Army during the war, and then when the war ended, none of the family had anything to do, because they had sold the old engine plant to National Supply, and they weren't getting along with them anyhow. And Joe and P.J. had been on the board at Bauer for a number of years. So when the war ended, that's when the Shouvlin brothers and my grandfather bought out the Bauer brothers. That's how they got connected with Bauer.
Interesting background.
Yeah, P.J. was a very, very interesting person. Very private person. He was not very much involved in the activities in Springfield when he first came here, but he was on the first city commission in 1913, I think it was. And he was active in his trade association. He was on the board of the National Supply Company. He was a very quiet person. Traveled a lot, of course, because there aren't many oil fields in Springfield. Quite a guy. He and I were pretty good friends. And he lived to be 95. He worked till he was 80-some. He'd go to the shop every day and walk through the shop. I think he knew everybody there by the first name. This was both at National Supply and at Bauer.
Now, Charlie Bauer ran Bauer Brothers before Shouvlin's got involved.
Charlie retired in 1946.
As I remember, when I came here in '43, he was thought of as one of the leading industrialists in Springfield.
Yeah, he was. We lived right next door to Charlie, out on East High Street, which is now, well, the house we lived in is now in Heights of Pythias home, and right next where Charlie Bauer lived is the Church of the Nazarene. But Charlie was married. His wife's name, can't think of her name now, but they had no children. They lived in the big house there. Charlie retired, and I guess he just ran the Covenant Presbyterian Church after that. What I've heard. He used to stand in the back of the church at service on Sunday, and the minister was talking too long. Oh, Charlie had hold up his wrist and tap his watch to the sign. Sermon's too long.
It seems to me there was a man that ran the James Leffel Company that also was very much involved with Covenant Church.
J. Robert Groff.
Yes.
J. Robert Groff.
I need to change the tape. This is the start of the second side in the interview with Dan Shouvlin. I think what we need to do now is to get your ideas of the industrial community as you see it today in Springfield, with some idea that maybe 10 years from now these interviews are going to be looked at to write a history of Springfield, and to get your ideas as to, do you think we're on the right path of development? Do you think that Springfield is making progress? Do you see it as a, even though you confess that you're 75, that you see among the people you know as being a favorable industrial climate?
Yeah, I think so. I think the Chamber of Commerce has done an extraordinarily good job in bringing new business to Springfield. We have, Prime Ohio out there that has, I think, 7 or 8 new businesses.
It's quite amazing.
Yeah. And they're mostly all foreign companies that are manufacturing now in the U.S. The one that just finished that huge warehouse is Aldi, which is
I was just going to ask you about that. I can't understand. Why would they put that here?
It's a distribution center for them in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. They have these, these retail stores all over the area, and this is a distribution center. I think that building is 400,000 or 500,000 square feet of warehouse space. They're a German company. And we have, of course, Rittal, who is a very fine company and expanding, and they bought the old Bauer plant on the Upper Valley Pike. And there are several smaller industrial parks. There's one up on North 68, just below, just south of the Navistar plant, that is supplying just-in-time parts to Navistar. And then there are other plants out in the Prime Ohio that are supplying parts and raw materials to the auto industry, primarily to the auto industry, Honda and Toyota. So I'd say right now Springfield's industrial base is better than it was, certainly better than it was 10 years ago. Navistar, fortunately, is still going. You knock on wood every now and then. They're not a big profit maker, which is too bad, because it's a big company and they ought to be making a lot more money than they are. And you always wonder if hard times come, whether they're going to have enough reserves to survive.
I think they're tied into pretty heavy union contracts.
Yeah, they're tough union contracts.
Yeah.
Well, that's going to be one of the problems for the whole country in some of the coming years. Back when, we had a union in Bauer. Of course, they had a union at the old Spirit Gas Engine Company. Now Cooper. We used to negotiate every 3 years. We have a 3-year contract, and we'd negotiate every 3 years. Well, some of the strategies back in those days were, well, we're not going to get much on the way of wages. We'll give you a nickel an hour wage increase, but we'll give you a little extra. We'll give you a penny or 2 pennies on insurance or pensions. I don't think at that time nobody realized what that was going to do in terms of the cost of insurance and the cost of pensions. And I think that is basically the problem that Navistar has. Is they have more retirees than they have people working.
Right.
It's just a heavy burden they have to pay, and I don't know what they're going to do about it. But, you know, they have some kind of deal, 30 and out or 20 and out there. They got people retiring, you know, in their early 50s and their 40s. That's not right. You know, a person shouldn't be retiring at that age. They got too many good years ahead of them. But I don't know how they're going to deal with that. But of course, you know, the problem of pensions and health care for the entire population is going to be a problem, and I certainly don't know the answer to that. But, in the case of Navistar, their problem is their retirees. They just have a terrible, I shouldn't say terrible, but they have a heavy burden to pay.
Real load.
Oh, it is a load.
It's a backbreaker, heavy.
And I think that to some extent that Kelsey Hayes, Spico had the same problem. And we did too at Bauer. You know, we had the same. We had the Auto Workers Union, but we took a strike in 1959 for 5 months, and we just couldn't afford the things that some of the unions were asking. We just said, hey, we can't do it. So they went out on strike for around 5 months. But you know, the old theory was, well, you give the employees a wage increase and you pass it along, and that doesn't work all the time. Well, particularly in our industry, because we had a lot of overseas competition. In fact, our primary competition was from Sweden and Germany, and you just couldn't pass along increases.
Do you think the school situation in Springfield is a deterrent to new industry?
Yes, it has been. You know, the only thing I know is what I've heard, but you know, I've heard people tell me the reason that they don't come to Springfield is because of the school system, the poor record of the public school system. And well, and even a number of the people that do come to work here live in Dayton and live in over Columbus. Quite a number of people live over in the Dublin area. Of course, now it's only a 30, 40-minute drive to Springfield.
It surprises me the several people on the Wittenberg faculty and staff that either live Dayton, Columbus, and a couple of them in Yellow Springs. One's in Cincinnati.
Well, the commuting's so easy these days with the interstate highway system, and people are going to live, I guess, where they think they want to live rather than where they're working. I think the schools Springfield schools are, I'm no judge of schools, but you read the statistics around the state and around the nation, we're, I would say, fairly low on the totem pole. And that does have a bearing when companies are coming to look at a place to locate. We've been very successful. I think Larry Krugowitz done an outstanding job with the changing of bringing new companies and new jobs into town.
I've been amazed that we've kept it. There, some years back, he was on the verge of moving, and that died out.
I think he likes it here. He's well liked.
I hope that Kathleen Neal, our new superintendent of schools, is given every chance. She looks to me like an awfully solid person with guts. And she has a husband who's a retired school superintendent.
Jack, he's a nice guy.
Wittenberger.
Well, I hope so. You know, we've had over the years, we've had some good people here. I think that were well qualified to come in. We had Morrissey, I think his name was here.
Remember Ed Holt?
Ed Holt, and then after that we've had some people, but some of them didn't stay long.
No.
And I think that, I think she's well qualified. She's a nice person. I think she's got lots of guts, which it takes to run that school system. But obviously, she's making some changes. We made a study. I was involved in a group that made a study of the schools. A lot of inefficiencies in the school system. A lot of problems there that I think could be resolved if somebody took some hard decisions. And I think she may. She may do that. She's a tough lady, a very nice lady.
It's about like bucking the civil service. Only that's worse.
Yeah, she's gonna have a tough job, but apparently she's able to do it, or will be able to do it. But
Yeah, I just hope that when that levy that they want comes up in the fall, that we'll back her. If not,
we
it'll
don't.
be a crushing blow.
Yeah, people are funny, you know. Once their kids are out of school and these issues come, they say, "I educated my kids. I'm out of here."
Taxes? Yeah.
No more
Yeah.
taxes.
No more taxes.
Too bad, you know, because when they were in school, somebody ahead of them paid the way. So it was very short-sighted. But I think that Springfield, you know, of course, I've had opportunities to move. As I said, Barbara wasn't real happy about coming here in the first place from Boston. But she got to love the place. And, you know, we had chances to move. Where else you're going to go is better than Springfield.
I never thought when I went to law school in Chicago that I'd wind up here doing what I did.
Yeah.
And enjoying it.
Yeah. Well, you know,
We came out here
in 1952 with a philosophy, we don't like it, we can leave. I'm still here. She loves Springfield.
Yeah.
But it's a great place to, you know, we've had people from all over the world come out to this research lab. We have people from Russia, Pakistan, almost every country in the world.
I had never heard that.
Yeah. It was a who's who of the paper industry that came out here. They'd stay a few days. They just thought Springfield was great.
Uh-huh.
In fact, we had a Russian group out a number of years ago. We had sold them some equipment to make masonite, hardboard. So they sent some engineers over here to learn how to run the equipment. And they were here for about 2 weeks. So one evening, I took the group out to the Springfield Country Club for dinner. And there were 4 engineers and one interpreter and one guy, we didn't know what he was. We figured he was the commissar. But he was the one he had a great sense of humor. So we were out at the country club having dinner, and they were having a party that night. So it was pretty lively. And all of a sudden he said to me, to the interpreter, "Government club." I said, "No, private club." "Private? Who owns it?" I said, "The members own it." "Who can be a member?" I said, "Well, anybody could get by the admissions committee. Anybody can be a member." "How much does it cost?" Of course, an out-of-town membership in those days, I think it's $50 a year, something very nominal. So I told him, he says, "I out-of-town member." But we've had people here from all over the world, and they just think Springfield's great. And, they've enjoyed it, you know, and they like the people here, and the amenities were always very good. Yeah. And the proximity, you know, you can get here so easily. No, I think Springfield's got a good future. We're in a great location, you know, right in the heart of everything. And, we've got some good new businesses here. So, of course, a lot of the old businesses are gone. You know, I had a list of the manufacturing companies here in 1900. A few of them left.
The family businesses are
all gone. Yeah.
Yeah.
All gone.
Yeah.
Well, you know, at one time we had the Waldenhofer family, had Thompson Grinders gone, had my own family, had 2 businesses that are gone. Montanus has had their business here, gone.
Recknagel.
There's a whole list of them, you know, that, gone by the wayside.
Yeah.
But new ones come, and I'll tell you, there are a lot of great young people that have developed businesses here in Springfield, like the McGregor brothers. I've got about 3 different businesses here.
I interviewed them. Was it Tim?
Tom?
Tom. I interviewed him. He gave me the whole story of the companies.
Well, you know,
I was amazed.
Of course, the McGregors have been here a long time, but it was their father, Johnny, that was an entrepreneur. And he got all those kids started in business. They've done very well.
Well, Dan, I don't want to wear you out. I think we've had an excellent interview. I say my thanks. And what we'll do is, when we get this transcribed,